Hello, I'm Shane Kilkelly.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to the second episode of General Intellect Unit, the podcast of the cybernetic Marxists. And this week, or I suppose this fortnight, we're going to be talking about a book called Four Futures by Peter Frase. Pretty cool little book. It was published in October of 2016, and it was sort of a follow-on or an expansion of an article Frase had wrote for Jacobin magazine in 2011. Is that about it? That's the right details.
Yes. I remember this article was kind of a big influence on me when it first came out in 2011. It was just that schematism that he comes up with in the book of these four futures was really attractive and interesting. I never had read the book before this opportunity, but definitely appreciated the article when it first came out.
Yeah, that's cool because I missed the article when it came out because I just wasn't reading Jacobin at the time. But I picked up the book, I think, when it launched. So again, it was published around this time last year. And it's kind of funny because when we were like a month ago trying to think about putting this show together, I didn't quite realize it at the time. But this book, I think, is very much foundational to our whole sort of way of thinking about the future or the possibilities of the future that are coming down the road and how technology and politics kind of relate to that. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we kind of very quickly settled on doing a talk through of this book for the first real episode of the show, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think this book, a lot of it is just kind of quoting various futurists or social critics or even like science fiction authors. But what's really useful about it is just that schema that he produces, and just having some categories to think with that's very powerful and interesting. And so I think it is a very good place to start.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the kind of the usefulness of the schema is that it sort of drills home this point that the future isn't inevitable. There isn't just one linear timeline that we advance on, and then we're inevitably going to end up in a particular kind of vision of the future. Because that's something I kind of see a lot of from the kind of techie libertarian kind of crowd. This kind of idea of like scientific determinism that, and it even gets brought up in relation to things like privacy and such, with relation to like internet surveillance and things. And the kind of pushback is usually that, it's just inevitable. Like it's inevitable that you'll end up under surveillance by Google specifically, you know, as if there's
just
no possibility at all.
Naturalizing these things.
Yeah, as if it's a totally natural, a force of nature that isn't in any way related to political or social choices. Which I think we mentioned in the first episode is kind of a nonsensical way to think. The technology sets up the base on which social change and stuff plays out. It doesn't make the change inevitable. So I suppose we probably get into the kind of general themes of the book. The introduction opens up with, I think, quite a fun kind of little line. And I quote, "It's two spectres are haunting Earth in the 21st century, the spectres of ecological catastrophe and automation," which I think is really fantastic. And Frase kind of sets it up initially that there's these two factors. Like we're seeing, recently we just passed like 400 parts per million of atmospheric carbon dioxide. We're seeing like increased sea acidification, declining ice in the caps and such, more drought and famine, more extreme storm events. But we're also seeing breakthroughs in technology in the context of like high unemployment, stagnant wages, a kind of like economy that's been depressed for a decade now, and a general sort of air of anxiety around automation, but like more generally just the future of work and the future of like what we sort of ordinary proletarian kind of people are going to do with ourselves when the robots take over.
I mean, there's a real fear of like insecurity of work and way of life. And he kind of breaks this down into the fear of scarcity, which is the climate change issue, versus the fear of abundance, which is the automation issue. And again, like, it's not that we're actually afraid of abundance. It's that our tenuous relationship to the means of production puts us into a position of fear.
Yeah, it's a kind of a fear, and he sort of like he quotes a lot of writing on this kind of topic, and I'm sure a lot of the audience will just be familiar with it by being kind of online and paying attention to any of this sort of stuff. But you have books like The Second Machine Age. You have like constant features in Wired and Mother Jones and such on this sort of topic of like the robots are coming, the automation is coming, and the anxiety is kind of born from this like acknowledgement that like the means of production will change and the kind of like the mechanical base of society will change, but that under our current social relations, it's really hard to imagine that playing out well.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, one point he makes is that automation has increasingly been threatening professional and creative industries that have seemed immune to it previously. And I think that, in a very practical sense, that is one reason why this podcast has an audience, I think, right? That because these jobs have become precarious in a way they weren't before, like, people have a material interest in thinking critically about these things.
Yeah.
And,
It's when programmers start to worry about the possibility of their own work being automated away, or when people who thought their jobs were safe because they were in marketing or something, or even the very highest levels of like white collar work, where like there's like some like very big corporation or some sort of bank that now has an artificial intelligence on its board. That like even the highest of all high flying jobs, the CEO or the board of directors level of gigantic companies, even that's not safe from automation.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen, working as a translator at times, and even an interpreter at times, which is a much higher skilled job in some ways, that automation is not like it's not a distant boogeyman that is affecting the market. It's actually like materially depressing incomes now. In that sector. Like it's already here.
It's already here. Yeah, exactly. And the other. So I mean, like that. I think that's one we don't really need to explain in much detail. Like Phrase spends quite a few pages on this in the introduction, but for our audience, we all know this is happening. And the other big thing that we all know is happening is just ecological crisis that is really bearing down on us now. Stuff's getting a lot warmer, and weather's getting a lot worse, and we're kind of starting to see really worrying signs of like impacts on food supply, and just like beyond just food supply, we're thinking about like access to resources at all, or like access to the ability to live near the sea is starting to be eroded in some places, and the ability to live further inland is being eroded.
It's like, I mean, we're recording this in October 2017, and like, Puerto Rico has kind of been the poster child for what this kind of catastrophe could look like, where like, just access to all like essentials pretty much being wiped out, the food supply being wiped out after a program of neoliberal restructuring in the economy that had already devastated it. So like this is, we can see one of these four futures staring us in the face.
Pretty much
right now.
This is stuff that's definitely happening now. So Phrase kind of like, he starts from these kind of like, I suppose he sort of starts by saying that he's going to be deliberately kind of vague about some of the details of the futures he's going to describe. And it's kind of a work of, not really a work of deep kind of analysis and like serious kind of academic thinking, but instead a kind of work of imagination. It's not quite futurism, but it's kind of like a social science fiction, I think is the way he puts it. So that the kind of he outlines these kind of like possibilities for the future, and stays in many cases kind of deliberately vague about the details, but the axioms he kind of pins down are he's just going to presume automation, like pretty extensive automation, like either, and that's just whatever it happens to mean in your head, you know. And the other axiom is that ecological crisis and class power will be the kind of variables. They'll be the dials we get to turn, or like the dials that can turn in that kind of those kind of futures. And that we'll have this kind of like triple crisis of automation crisis, an ecological crisis, and a kind of crisis in the capitalist system, where it becomes just becomes less and less viable over time as competition for resources intensifies, and the kind of material base on which it's all built, the kind of labor relation, that gets just eroded away. And he kind of has this kind of broad vision that we can't go back to the past. We can't really hold on to what we've got. Something new is definitely coming. And that something new will be the result of political struggle and choice. Like we do have some kind of choice in how this plays out.
Right. Yeah. He kind of describes it as this contradictory dual crisis, and it is pushing us towards making choices as a society. Absolutely.
So do you want to explain what the four futures are, and the kind of axes they're built on?
Oh yeah, sure. So there are basically these four futures, which are communism, rentism, socialism, and exterminism. And these are the result of two axes of analysis. So you have the kind of social dimension of equality versus hierarchy, and then the material dimension of abundance versus scarcity, right? So the question of automation, because it's held constant in every case, doesn't really figure into those axes. And so you end up with these four different futures of whether you have an equal society and whether you have a kind of abundant society.
Right. Yeah. And those are the class power and ecological crisis as the kind of those variables that get to be tweaked. I suppose before we kind of launch into the first actual chapter on communism, we should probably outline. Like, I think this book is a little strange in that it's kind of lumpy in how it's laid out. Like some parts, some paragraphs and pages sort of breeze by and sort of paint a picture in your mind of like possibilities. And then other sort of bits of the book dig a little bit further down into concrete theories or actual examples of the kind of stuff he's talking about. And I think that lumpiness will probably inform a bit of our discussion on this, because there's kind of various ways in which things poke out a bit too much, and then there's other ways in which it kind of dips down a little bit into territory that's maybe a little bit too vague to kind of grapple with.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this book is really a classic of social science or futurism or anything like that, or social science fiction. But I think the real value is just in outlining these possibilities. And even though the particulars of the book probably could have used another edit or two, it's still interesting to go through each of them, and we'll just try to sort of flesh out what he means by each of these categories and what we think about it, I suppose.
Yeah, certainly. So the first chapter is on, it's titled Communism, Equality and Abundance. And it's what it says. It's that intersection of the graph where you've got of a highly egalitarian society, combined with pretty significant abundance. Like the way this future is laid out, it's that either the ecological crisis turns out to not be as bad as we think it would be, or some kind of miracle intervention comes along, like we invent a kind of new free source of energy, or we really nail down carbon sequestration.
Yeah, like what if we had fusion power, right? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right?
And he kind of does liken it to basically to Star Trek, in which those two things are kind of true, right? Where in Star Trek they have like just a mysterious source of power that never seems to run out, and they have like replicators where they can simply call up any kind of thing they could imagine. And it seems that society is just based on pure abundance of both energy and material resources. But a lot of this kind of chapter floats around it kind of takes that kind of idea as a broad basis, and like you can kind of use your imagination to fill in what that technical base would probably be like. Like it'd be either robots making everything, or some kind of magic replicator thing. But a lot of the chapter instead just focuses on the relationship between work and meaning, and tries to tackle the usual objection to fully automated luxury space communism, which is that, oh, well, if we get rid of work, then what are we going to do all day?
Yeah, and won't everything just be meaningless, right? He frames this chapter to begin with as a kind of critique of Kurt Vonnegut's book, Player Piano, and the arguments against communism that are presented there.
So I've never read Player Piano, but it seems that it's a book that's kind of about some sort of automation stuff, but it's kind of like written from a sort of an older perspective, and that it's sort of like, I think his critique is a lot of his critique is that it sort of misses out on some of the problems of even categorizing some activities as work or not work. Like I think one of the examples he leans on is that like the character's wife performs a lot of emotional labor, which isn't classified as labor in that society, and so doesn't get a front seat in the story being a kind of analysis of how a guy manages when his work is automated away or something.
Yeah, like Fraze writes that the problem of automation turns out to be a crisis of male feelings. And I think that's pretty spot on in a lot of ways, because I mean, it's really interesting because Vonnegut was a writer, and like a working writer. You know, it's obvious if you read his books that like he had to really hustle to make a go of it. And yeah, like that is not like the kind of job that would fall into like you go out there and you struggle with nature, like you work the soil and you topple the trees, and you know,
it's
like
a very masculine idea of work.
Yeah, but writing is something that is much closer to emotional labor, and yet it's thought of in terms of that kind of masculinist conception of work. So it's very, very interesting example there. But I think that the core point that that Fraze is making is a very strong point, that reproductive labor, as Marx would have called it, often, or you know, as emotional labor as is a part of that, is often something that's considered kind of taken for granted. Like it's not considered to be labor at all.
It's explicitly taken for granted in the sort of capitalist system, where capitalism is impossible without a parallel domestic world in which labor is reproduced without capital's kind of explicit input.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so, if you take the perspective of this kind of patriarchal capitalism, and then you imagine the introduction of automation, it seems as though everything humans do has been erased. But if you actually start from a perspective of, well, what does human society actually look like as a whole? And if you pay attention to the existence of work that is usually done by women, then yeah, it's a kind of a different picture. You notice that there's a lot more going on there than what takes place in a wage labor relation in a kind of male-dominated industry.
Yeah, and it's sort of, I think, related to, I think it's a point that sort of comes up a few times later in the book, that bringing in the externalities. Because again, the reproduction of labor is kind of external to capital currently, and is thus kind of a little bit invisible. We don't really take account of it, and like seemingly Vonnegut wasn't kind of woke enough to take account of it either. But when you do start to account for the entirety of human experience, you get a broader picture, and you kind of like no longer see human sort of endeavor as just a competition of dominance. You start to see a lot more of the ways in which we spend like not insignificant amounts of time looking after each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you really wanted to push the idea that Phrase presents in the introduction, that everything is automated, you would assume that emotional labor would also be automated. In which case you would have this very sort of strange, like, you know, I don't know what it would even be, singularity kind of situation or something, where we just have AIs that are somehow interacting with our personalities to perform emotional labor.
Into the Matrix.
I guess kind of. I mean, it's really hard to say. I mean, like, you know, I think that's an interesting avenue for science fiction, but I think the assumption that Phrase kind of works off of is that portion of labor is not automated, right?
Yeah, or at the very least, it that portion of labor, the kind of emotional labor, or just I suppose non-physical labor, non-masculine labor, simply then could become the kind of venue in which we play out the actual lives we want to live. Like, I think he even sort of says it directly that, like, once the sort of material base of necessity is taken care of, we can explore how to take care of each other.
Yeah, and I think the other issue that I think comes up in Ian Banks's culture books is kind of like, if emotional labor is automated, can you really even speak about it as automation anymore? Right? Yeah. Like, the things that we consider to be sort of essentially human in some ways fall into that category. And so, like, it kind of explodes the entire notion of an automated society where you kind of set it and forget it. Like, the Star Trek replicator, right, is kind of just like you give it an order and it does magic, right? But if it's something like the automated task is to educate a child in a sort of a meaningful and holistic sense, then maybe that's not really automation, right? Maybe that's something completely different. So
that is a radically different thing. Yeah.
That's another possible avenue to think about how this kind of communist society could be meaningful and make sense in some way.
Yeah, so Phrase kind of talks about Marx for a little bit, about how Marx kind of outlined communism and socialism as kind of the process of overcoming labor and leisure, and that a socialist society would kind of rationalize and democratically control the realm of necessity, as in the kind of like realm of material necessities, in order to set up the realm of freedom as the kind of new stage in which the actual sort of dramas of human life play out.
Yeah, right. So it's this new stage of history where people are able to be all-sided individuals who develop all their potentialities, and they, well, at least in every way that they want to, and they also are able to find meaning in labor instead of doing a, you know, kind of a day job sort of thing, and then going home and recording podcasts as something that is actually meaningful to them as people.
Yeah. And he kind of then segues from there into kind of talking about, like, reminding us that at one point in time, gains in productivity we used to think about gains in productivity as being taken either in more pay or in less hours. So like Keynes and like a lot of his contemporaries kind of talked about, they presumed that by 2017, we'd be working like 4 hours a week. But what's actually kind of played out in the intervening time, I think Keynes was in the 30s or something.
Yeah, I think he wrote that essay in the 20s or 30s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in the intervening time, we've instead kind of taken the gains in productivity, which have been huge since then. We've taken those gains as kind of more compensation with which to buy more stuff, and that's kind of given us this consumerist kind of culture, which has kind of blinded
big
us.
Scare quotes there.
Huge scare quotes. Yeah. Like, I don't want more money. I want to stop working entirely. That's my desire. I fucking hate work. It's awful. But I think this is a good way to kind of remind us that, like, we kind of should hate work. Like, nobody should want to fucking do this, you know? Or nobody, like, this, we should be able to decouple what we find satisfactory from what is necessary to exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And this a lot of this kind of, the early part of this chapter is to kind of just set up this kind of reminder that, you know, we can do post-work. We could even do it today, largely, if we were to kind of undertake the right kind of redistribution. And to just kind of push back against that notion that we should, like, that it's natural to work, 40 or 50 hours a week. In the same way that, like, previously it was natural to work 70 hours a week, but then we pushed back against that, got it revised down, like, we got the weekends off, you know. And we could just keep going with that, like Keynes wanted to. And Keynes presumed we would do that and then end up working basically 4 hours a week, like the Jetsons. You know, that's kind of the classic pop culture reference.
Yeah, he just kind of assumed that the trends of, well, I mean, he didn't really get into the particulars as to why people had more leisure time. Like, he didn't really talk about the labor movement struggling for this stuff, but he did assume that there was a relationship between productivity growth and work time reduction that would continue to hold true into the future, and obviously has not. In fact, it's gone the other way, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But we could go back. We could go back to that way of thinking and actually aim for a post-work society, which is kind of what this, like, communist society would be. I think a really interesting little bit is that Fraze uses this example of, like, to kind of illustrate how, like, social attitudes towards employment and such really shape our thinking. There was this study of, like, the unemployed in Germany who were, like, they were kind of getting towards retirement, and they were, like, long-term unemployed. So imagine someone who's maybe unemployed for 3 or 4 years and then hits retirement age and then flips over into being retired. And again, like, Germany has this really nice kind of social security system where it's like you can kind of do that, and it's you don't kind of end up on the streets. But that the study found that basically on the day they became retired, these people's entire outlook on life changed. That they were suddenly no longer anxious about their unemployment status, but, like, their material status didn't change. They were unemployed before, and they were basically unemployed afterwards. But what did change was the social expectation of employment.
Yeah, I mean, if you've ever been through long-term unemployment, this obviously should ring true. I mean, I've been there. It's a grinding, hellish experience, but yeah, I have no expectation that retirement would be a grinding, hellish experience. That's not something I've seen from people who've retired, except for ones who, like, some people fall so deep into the pattern of alienated work that they are basically fundamentally damaged as people and cannot imagine existing in any way except for performing alienated work for someone else. They have lost the ability to actually work in the sense that Marx describes, right? Because it's completely possible to labor once you've retired and find that to be meaningful. I mean, of course, there's still difficulties about having access to the means of production and everybody else in society existing in this alienated regime of labor that you have to interface with. But nevertheless, people do find meaningful work they can do in retirement. And that opportunity is there. It's just a matter of whether you've managed to get through your working career as a still sort of functional, adaptive human being who is able to be creative in some sense, except for when even if a boss isn't telling you to do it, right?
Yeah, that you haven't caught like capitalist brain disease by the end of your existence.
Yeah.
So one way of thinking about this sort of communist future is like generalized retirement. Imagine if we were all retired. Imagine if I was retired right now. That'd be pretty awesome, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I used to be a grad student on scholarship, which is kind of like this. Like it's kind of somewhere in between. It was my experience, was that on the one hand, you have the freedom to do what you want to do, but on the other hand, you still kind of experience the crushing guilt and insecurity that is associated with unemployment. So because it's like everybody around you expects you to be a wage laborer. But if that expectation was removed, then I think if I was in that situation, I would probably work about 20% less, but not much, less than that, because there's just so many things I want to do. So,
I think that rings true. That rings true for a lot of techies, like where you kind of ask them like, oh, what would you do if you could retire? Or like if you won the lottery, this kind of stuff. And the answer is usually, oh, I would do open source all day. Or, they would like, or some combination of that and like play with their kids, or, go back to college and really do deep mathematics sort of stuff. But this is a kind of a theme that people aren't unaware of this as a sort of possibility or as a kind of desire. It's just kind of getting there is the big question. And then Phrase does kind of segue into that again, where it's like, how do we get there? And he kind of outlines that like a kind of big revolutionary moment is probably not on the cards, because in the society we live in, that's probably just not like desirable, like a big kind of like, or I suppose violent kind of flip over into a new society. But it's also kind of like, I think from our understanding of the 20th century, it's also not very effective. Like it's kind of not really possible to kind of have a big bang moment where you get rid of one system and then afterwards try to figure out how to slip into another one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thinking about that he's approaching the issue from is a little bit. It's just informed maybe by sort of the sense in which armchair Marxists in America may talk about these issues, but like it's not like these societies all around the world in the 20th century went into violent revolution just because they were like, well, what if violent revolution? I mean, it's like
it was driven by these conditions.
There were a lot of inciting factors that led up to those revolutions. And like, yes, it was an international movement that had trained professional revolutionaries behind it. But it wasn't like people just kind of voluntarily were like violent revolution, which is in fact how some people on the left do think about this issue.
Tankies and such, they sort of they kind of think of it in these kind of terms. But yeah, and the question still kind of remains of like how to get to it, and he points out the decommodification of labor as really central to this kind of transition, and it's something that's already kind of central to European social democracies right now. The notion that like you decommodify labor by decoupling the ability to survive from the act of actually selling your labor, and that basically means just putting in some kind of social security net, like your unemployment benefits, or even looking forward a bit, a universal basic income. which is it's another topic that comes up over and over again in the book. It seems to be a feature in all of the chapters to some degree or another. And the idea here would be that if you were to institute a universal basic income, you would be able to gradually erode the money economy as automation takes over and more of the things that people actually need are not bought for money. They're just kind of the result of automation. And that there would be kind of like a pressure, like a kind of I'm not even totally sure I understand this, but like a kind of a pressure on wages that they would kind of normalize out to kind of flatten out with the basic income. And over the course of years, you would sort of transition into this essentially moneyless society. I'm not totally sure how that would actually work out, but I think that's the broad strokes of the way he paints it are pretty compelling.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, the one key thing is that these provisions of decommodified goods, they have to be universal, right? That's a key thing, because if you introduce something like means testing as a welfare system, so that you only provide benefits or like decommodified goods for poor people or specially disadvantaged people in some way, it actually is quite perverse, because it encourages the overall commodification of labor instead of actually working towards its removal. So even though you can make the argument that, like, oh, well, providing benefits to the poor is a socialist good because it's doing something for society, if you think about it for a second, you realize, like, no, actually we're just trapping ourselves in wage labor. Like, that's so the important thing is that these things be universally provided. And if they are universally provided and the other things in the economy are provided to some extent by the UBI, basically the more things you decommodify, the less the money you have in the economy is worth, really, because you
can't buy anything with it, really.
Or you wouldn't need to, or you wouldn't want to, right? So it's like if you think about the money you get as mainly being there to reproduce you as a human being, to pay your wage bill as something that you need to survive and to buy the things you need to carry on your lifestyle, then the more that those things become decommodified, the less and less the money is worth.
Exactly, yeah. So, like, imagine a kind of future where, like, housing is decommodified, food, or at the least staple foods, are decommodified.
Exactly.
Healthcare, public transportation. There's just like a citywide free Uber equivalent sort of set up, and it's all this futuristic stuff. Then what do you spend the money on aside from, like, really nice drugs?
Yeah, right.
And, like, bits of art and, like, Fabergé eggs and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, you know? And that's kind of the scenario he's looking at. So, like, the things that you still can buy with money would be supplemented with UBI, and the things that would just considered to be of universal necessity and desirability would be provided in a moneyless kind of sense.
Yeah. Which just sounds it sounds nice. I think I would quite like that.
Yeah.
And then the sort of part 2 of this chapter kind of takes a little bit of a diversion, but it sort of fills in that last gap about, like, what do you actually do in this society, and he kind of outlines this kind of he points towards the existence of status hierarchies separate from the capital and labor hierarchy. And kind of points out that even if you eliminate that kind of master hierarchy of capital and labor, you're still left with plenty of drama and interesting stuff to do. But the difference is that you won't die from malnutrition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of an attempt to give some content to the idea of communism as a society, right?
Yeah. And there's a sort of example he uses of a book, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom by Cory Doctorow. Have I got that right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, in which the author sort of portrays this like post-scarcity society, but like the book is like set in the Disney's Magic Kingdom, but it's like a post-capitalist version of it where people just hang out and party and that sort of thing. You've read the book, haven't you?
Yes, I did. It was quite a while ago, but I did read it in my first year of undergrad.
What are your thoughts on that kind of I don't know, that kind of picture of how society would still kind of be interesting and cool to live in?
Yeah, I mean there are I think I think that Dr. O's vision is still a little bit bleak in some sense, because yes, there are like character interactions that happen in the book, but generally there's this kind of ennui going on, and this society that is basically structured around like Facebook likes or Twitter follows or whatever, like whatever kind of social currency you find in a social media network.
They've got like a currency called Woofy or something.
Yeah,
which
Whoopee,
is kind of,
Whoopee, I think it is, yeah. Which is basically just like Facebook likes before Facebook likes were really a thing, right?
which is kind of scary.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Not totally keen on that.
not really great.
No. But then Phrase does kind of compare it to kind of more contemporary kind of phenomena like the Bitcoin and Dogcoin, and where Bitcoin is like a very financialized, like very serious person sort of cryptocurrency thing, but the Dogcoin equivalent is this like really silly joke that's like only used as a kind of liquid form of Facebook likes. But again, the idea of that being the kind of turned into, I don't know, I'm not completely keen on like reifying Facebook and making it a thing in the world or something like that. I don't know. But I think it does serve a decent purpose as like just an illustration that like, contrary to the usual objections, like life wouldn't be boring after we take care of all our material needs. It would in fact be knocking out that lowest part of Maslow's pyramid, and then that being the kind of platform on which the rest of history plays out, with the nice kind of guarantee that you're not going to starve to death.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's probably some better examples out there of what that might look like that we will discuss on this podcast. So
yeah, we're gonna do some episodes on probably on the culture novels and how they kind of relate to these kind of ideas. But yeah, that's the chapter on communism. I think it's pretty compelling stuff. If kind of a bit. I found I had to take a lot of notes to keep a lot of this straight in my head. But I think the core idea is compelling, that like a PostWork, if you take this kind of an egalitarian society with abundance, then moving beyond the wage relation is actually possible and desirable and not boring when you do it. That's kind of a cool set of ideas. So the second chapter is rentism, the intersection of hierarchy and abundance. And this kind of like, this differs in that it's basically the same technical base where you kind of presume automation that can provide for everyone. But that possibility is then stymied by a ossified class structure and the state power that reinforces that class structure. So you kind of end up with like Star Trek, but with DRM on the replicators, is the kind of the picture that's being painted here.
Yeah, it's everything is Adobe Creative Cloud, right?
Where like that is very much the idea he kind of plays with, this idea that like intellectual property as a form of rent where you like you don't really control things, you control patterns and like ideas and software. So it's kind of like, even if you had replicators, the question then is like, who controls the software running on them and who controls the license keys to all the like the hamburger recipe and the coffee mug recipe on the replicators.
Yeah, so we were talking earlier about how, given abundance, a lot of tech people would just spend their time working on open source. Well, this is a society in which jackbooted police officers come and beat the shit out of you for working on open source because it's getting in the way of rent extraction. Yeah.
God, I would love to see like a Judge Dredd plotline where he like smashes in the door of an apartment in one of these shitty tower blocks and just like guns down this dude for like hacking on the equivalent of the Linux kernel in that world.
Yeah, right.
But this I think this is a very real possibility of like a kind of at least a temporary outcome for the future, because like if you kind of drill down to the real sort of the basics of this, it's like you do have abundance, but you have a ruling class that is absolutely obsessed with preserving its control over society, and it's like the ownership of ideas on which that control is built.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think in a way, it is more of a commentary on our present state of affairs than a sort of like comprehensively viable society in the long term, because the regime of intellectual property control over the last, say, 30 years has intensified and become more and more draconian as a way of establishing a hierarchy of states in the world system, right? Like refusing access to scientific and engineering knowledge to poor countries is a huge legal apparatus that has come about in the world. And so we can see in that sense how like rentism is kind of like intuitive, and like at a personal level we can think of things like Adobe Creative Cloud, right? Or like any other kind of like sort of software as a service kind of arrangements, as just these kind of ongoing rent streams that become all pervasive, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And one of the examples he uses is how a lot of like modern farm machinery is absolutely riddled with DRM, where like you can't repair your own tractor without taking it to the dealership and having. But the thing is just festooned with like little microcomputers and things to control everything, from the actual sort of mechanics of the tractor to like the fucking armrests are like they have a little DRM chip in them that like will refuse to raise if you've like fiddled with the software. And that feeds back into what you were saying, that like exporting, like if you're a struggling third world nation, you want to import tractors, the only fucking choice available to you now is these horrible fucking machines that like you can't really work with because they're so encumbered, and like you don't really own the machine. It's you own the physical machine, but like it's useless without all the software stuff. And well, there was another thing like of like some car manufacturer or something that could like remotely deactivate the thing if like you were in violation of some like terms of service thing that you didn't even read, that they could like just satellite into the car and just turn it off while it's running, you know?
Yeah, I think there's this spread of the idea of property that you buy actually being something that you lease, that has originated in the software world, but is sort of insidiously spreading throughout the rest of life as the so-called Internet of Things becomes more and more pervasive, right?
So we kind of touched on this, but like I think that this future is kind of overflowing with tension and contradictions. I think like it seems very high energy and like skittish, and like as if it wouldn't hold for very long before it transformed into something else.
That's right. Because ultimately, if we assume, as Phrase does, that automation is just like a given, then it really becomes kind of unclear how the system works. Because, again, to go back to this example, Adobe Creative Cloud makes sense because if I'm using Adobe Creative Cloud to produce commodities and selling them, and then using a portion of my revenues to pay my rent to Adobe to use their means of production, then that's a relationship that makes sense. But if we're in total automation, it's kind of like there's this problem of effective demand where it's like rent is just a secondary category. It's something that takes from production. And so if production is just kind of a given and it doesn't really involve any kind of particular class of producers, then how does rent even make sense, right?
Yeah, like what does a parasite latch onto if there are no living hosts?
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah.
And a Phrase he tries to tackle this a little bit by kind of like that. He does bring this up as like, if there's no need for labor, then how do people earn the money to spend on the DRM encumbered replicators? He kind of points out maybe creative work is kind of a thing, but then again, I don't know, if you're like AIs are writing music for you, then lawyers for like companies, because this whole system is built around the control of ideas and concepts. Like copyright infringement would be a huge business, or like the lawyering up to counter copyright infringement would be a huge thing, like the kind of franchise wars in Demolition Man.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where somebody infringed on your license to the I don't know, the coffee mug license or whatever, and then there would be like just a planet full of lawyers or something, which is scary. I don't like that.
Yeah, and there are actually some libertarian visions coming out, or that have come out of Silicon Valley, that envision a world in which basically access to everything is legalized in terms of property rights, and you would have this world of just kind of all pervasive legal entanglement.
What an appalling hellscape.
Yeah, no, it sounds like an absolute nightmare, but to some very strange people, this sounds like utopia.
Sort of the last category, well, he kind of brings up guard labor as well as another thing, which I think comes up in a later chapter as well.
Yeah, it's like guard labor and then the kind of subsidiary to guard labor, which is management, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the guy holding the whip is the basically guard labor.
Yeah.
Fantastic. But the last kind of point he brings up is that it might be necessary because this problem of effective demand, it might be necessary to kind of do redistribution via like universal basic income or something, and that might be in this kind of culture that's not very egalitarian. It's like a hierarchical society. They might then be inclined to tie that to like meaningless make work, which really sort of set off a little light bulb in my mind, like a really tiny dim one. Because I was thinking of an episode of Black Mirror. I think the episode is titled 5 million credits or something, but the fiction of that episode is kind of strange, where it's like a lot of people living in this underground kind of bunker in like these horrible little cells that have like wall to wall, ceiling to ceiling advertising panels, and they seem to spend all their days like cycling on bikes to earn credits. Like it's like exercise bikes, and it's kind of implied that they're generating power or something by doing this. Mm-hmm. Which doesn't make a shred of sense, because like it's like the thing of like people think, oh, you could generate free electricity by putting hamsters on wheels and then hooking up generators to the wheels, but then it would be cheaper. You do the math and it would turn out it would be cheaper to burn the hamsters.
Right.
It would be more efficient. So, but this got me thinking though, what's probably happening in that society is that it basically is post scarcity, but there's this bizarre and fucked up class structure that is absolutely obsessed with perpetuating itself. And so it ends up in this highly irrational local optima where like an underclass of people are kind of locked in a bunker to pretend to generate electricity in exchange for credits, which they then spend on like skipping ads on their like wall-sized TVs.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like if you think about the way that a lot of online video games have gone, where you have these kind of busy work activities, grinding activities that you do in order to earn an in-game currency, which you can spend. So the relation there is kind of meaningless. It's just a activity for the sake of doing the activity. Like you're only doing this work in order to fulfill some kind of purely formal requirement, right? And then you get some kind of meaningless in-game currency that you can use to unlock things, and that's kind of what labor might look like in this society. Like, oh, what if we just like gamified everything to make an underclass who were busy playing clicker games all the time? Like, yeah. But in a practical sense of like what's actually going around these days, it did seem to me that this kind of society might be something like what Y Combinator is envisioning with their UBI experiments. That they're trying to create some kind of like minimum subsistence level existence for people who are the victims of sort of disruptive automation. And therefore, they can create a society in which those who own the means of production are able to achieve kind of unfathomable levels of wealth on top of that.
Yeah, because like these are the same guys who talk about like the 21st century. They in the 21st century they want to see the first trillionaires emerge, and it's basically. They see UBI, like the universal basic income, as a way of installing a floor so that they can remove the ceiling entirely, and just like have this like, and it's not impossible to sympathize with, because like they'll be like, oh well, at least the baseline would be okay, but like it's probably not going to be very good, because it'll be like this horrible society where this minuscule elite have just like incredible wealth, while like literally everyone else, including the former middle class, live in basically capsule hotels with like just like nutrient sludge as their only meals, because that's the society would be tuned so that like the basic income is not anything that you could actually really live a satisfying life off of, except for this upper class that are able to live in just like grotesque opulence.
Well, and I mean, as Phrase says here, this is a society that is about power relations, right? And when you look at a society like that, where you have people living on a subsistence UBI and then trillionaires on top of that, you have to remember that money is a social relation, and it doesn't represent simply an access to like very basic necessities for survival. It also represents social power, right? So if you have a society, it's like, oh well, like everybody's kind of getting by, they're doing okay, but you have trillionaires on top of that. That's just a representation of how much more powerful those people are than everyone else, and absolutely those people would be likely to abuse their power in a very toxic way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if like, and you don't even need to imagine much to kind of get to that conclusion, because just look at how like absurdly cruel and fucking degenerate the current rich are, like. And then extrapolate forwards. Like if the ruling class seem just like callous, awful people today, that's just going to get worse, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of like what we've seen in terms of gentrification in a lot of world cities, so-called world cities, where people are pushed out of the city so that empty houses can replace them. That's the kind of relationship you would see in a society where people are living on a UBI and there is a class of trillionaires on top of that who are doing whatever whim suits them.
So that kind of, what we've just talked about there, I think sets up the final chapter. But before we get to that, we have the penultimate chapter, which is titled Socialism, Equality and Scarcity. I think this one's really interesting because it seems pretty realistic, as in like it's something that could I think we've just come off of rentism, which I think we're probably on the same page there, that it seems like that society is too loaded down with contradictions to really survive very long. But this one, the socialism one, does seem like it could actually really happen. And kind of Fraser outlines it as an egalitarian society which must work together to rebuild its relationship with nature. And it's kind of predicated on equality, so like the lack of the kind of capitalist labor and wage relations, but also scarcity, where either the automation stuff never really follows through fully, or it does, but we're just faced with such incredible ecological crisis that we are left counting every single molecule of carbon dioxide that's emitted. And that places a hard limit on what we can actually do economically.
Yeah. Yeah. Even though we have the potential to produce a lot more, we don't, because it would be suicidal.
It would kill us. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he kind of starts with like, there's scarcity, which is kind of a theme all throughout kind of like capitalist relations anyway. But particularly kind of like he points towards Malthus, the guy who was talking about the guy who predicted that, if population keeps growing, we'll all starve. He kind of turned out to be wrong because, well, I mean, sort of wrong, at least in the time frame he was talking about, because he failed to kind of account for advances in agriculture and such, which meant that like Malthus saw some material limits, and then as history played out, the limits moved, like the goalposts moved. And the same thing is true for like, that's not just for food, it's like for energy. So like once upon a time we had economies based on coal, and then based on oil, and then we had this idea of peak oil, which we're kind of past now. But then even if that energy stuff turns out to be limitless, you're still faced with this ecological problem that like if there just is a hard limit on how much abuse you can put on the planet, then it kind of doesn't matter whether Malthus was right or wrong in those kind of like terms, because like you butt up against a brick wall eventually.
Yeah.
And the question then becomes, how do you provide for everyone whilst also skirting through this crisis and not like tipping it over the edge?
Right. And it's a kind of rationing regime, right?
It's quite austere, and it's kind of like this this regime in which like enormous change is required. Like you need just like radically overhauled energy infrastructure. Food production has to change. Manufacturing has to change radically.
A good way to think about this example, I think, is to look at Cuba in the 90s.
Right.
Where they drastically overhauled their infrastructure in order to deal both with the collapse of the USSR as a source of aid and a trading partner, and also to deal with the ecological realities that were happening in Cuba at that time. So they really kind of pioneered this sort of ecological socialist approach. And I think you can see that on a global level in this kind of scenario.
Yeah, definitely. And like I think Fraser asserts that this all requires efficiency on a scale that is so much further out than what free markets can actually provide. Like it's when you need absolute efficiency in distribution and in supply chains, then kind of free market stuff is kind of out of the question because it's just too wasteful.
Right.
And you're into the territory of kind of needing central planning of some kind to kind of ensure that you can produce and ship all the food without tipping over the balance into just like ecological catastrophe.
Yeah, and I think it was like Min-Chi Lee who wrote a book fairly recently about how, you know, we kind of need a world socialist ecological regime, you know, sometime by like the middle of this century, or we're pretty much done for as a civilization.
Yeah, and in case the listeners haven't picked it up, that's kind of what we're all about on this show.
Yes,
we're big into this kind of idea. Yeah, so it's like this. I think it's a really compelling sort of vision of like a relatively austere kind of future, but one in which we do commit to ensuring that basically everyone gets through it.
Yeah, that's really the thing here is like, what's the upside to this scenario? Well, the upside is equality, right? Like the upside is avoiding mass genocide. Like that.
Yeah, which is a pretty sweet upside, I think.
Yeah, that's like, actually, now that you put it that way, I guess that this is not so bad. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you pose that kind of question to people, or like you kind of like explain it in these terms, and it's like, okay, like how do you feel about, I don't know, 5.5 billion graves? Like, oh, you don't like that? Okay, well then get on this train. You know, we're going for the socialist future then, because like. Yeah, the alternatives are substantially worse.
That's right. And and so like this regime was kind of supposed to involve like national service for environmental and disaster work. And then
he kind of points towards the end of the chapter. He sort of says that like life in this future could be as boring as simply plugging in your ration tokens into the replicator and then heading off to work at the Civil Conservation Corps.
So yeah, basically you could spend your ration in the form of like a UBI buying things from a consumer market, and that would give you some consumer freedom, even though you would be working under a material constraint.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think like Frey's kind of raises at the very back of this the possibility of using markets as like a technology of planning. He kind of decouples markets from the kind of like capitalist way we know them, and kind of uses the example of I think the city of Los Angeles did a parking kind of scheme where there was all like smart meters in the roads and in the cars and in the parking spaces, and the price of parking was dynamically adjusted according to demand. And the key difference there is that it wasn't a market that was used for the planning of production. It was used as a way of planning consumption. And it was transparent because it was owned by the city. It didn't have the usual problems that people object to, such as like the market anarchy of piling up luxuries while basic staples aren't produced. It was a nice sort of transparent kind of user-friendly market. Or I suppose another example would be if you were to simply nationalize Uber, you know, where
they have their like, what is it, like rush pricing or so that's similar to this parking scheme that he was talking about. And I mean, the essential thing to note here is that everyone is getting the same income. So this is a matter of choice as to where you want to park, how convenient you want your parking spot to be, or when you want to catch a cab. It's not a matter of how much you can afford, right? Like, it's not like, oh, I went into first class seating because I am a member of the bourgeoisie. It's I went into first class seating because I prefer being more comfortable than spending my money on other things, right?
Yeah, and the plane is empty otherwise in that scenario. It's a really important point that like under our current system, like markets can be oppressive because $6 to one person might mean a very different thing than $6 to a rich person. Whereas in this kind of scheme, you'd have the markets are for limiting consumption. They're not for kind of the price signaling to kind of allocate the resource that we're kind of accustomed to.
Yeah, they're not just a vehicle for representing class power.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a pretty cool chapter. It feels like it's probably where it's a possibility for where we'll end up, where we can make the choice to not genocide everyone and work out a new relationship with nature and to kind of resituate ourselves within the natural world, and not in a way where we back away from it and like pretend that we can exist outside of nature, but just acknowledging, yeah, we have got to find a way to actually survive now, and one that minimizes impact and kind of lets us be inside the world without either us destroying it or it destroying us.
Yeah, and it's kind of important to note that this is not necessarily a permanent rationing regime, right? It could be something that we do to try to clean up our situation here on Earth and get into some kind of livable way of life. Even though like the resources of Earth are obviously finite and we need to respect the incredible value of the ecosystem that we have here, which is unique as far as we know, certainly we could, make use of the incredibly vast resources in space if we had a society that was able to kind of get that together and distribute the rewards in an equitable way. So like building space colonies and exploiting the like incredible, almost unfathomable mineral wealth of the asteroid belt would be ways that we could transition from like a more socialist kind of scarcity situation to a more communist abundance kind of situation. It's not ruled out in this kind of scenario.
Yeah, exactly. And in that kind of transition that you've outlined, the thing that changes is the material base, but the thing that remains constant is the social dedication to egalitarianism. That's the key thing. And like, if for the listener, like if you are into this idea of like, asteroid mining and colonizing space and doing all those sort of thing, and then getting into these good futures, you do need to keep in mind that we need to change our social relations to be much more egalitarian, because otherwise we're going to end up in a pretty awful future, which is the topic of the final chapter, titled Exterminism, Hierarchy and Scarcity. And in this one, Fraze leads with an example from the film Elysium, where you have like a space station with all the rich, like, ruling class just living in this kind of really amazing sort of utopia, but it's on this little isolated space station, and like the surface of the Earth is just this ghastly fucking reality for the mass of humanity. And it's kind of, he uses that to illustrate this kind of situation where you have the rich living what is basically a communism of the few. And while they have like automated away the need for labor, and then they ultimately conclude that because they don't need the labor anymore, they should probably just kill them and, exterminate the poor instead of bothering to, be human and nice. It's pretty grim.
Yeah. That's the scenario presented by Fraze. It's not exactly the plot of Elysium, but absolutely, it's very, very grim. It's kind of like the point he makes is that the capital-labor relation is a contradictory relation, and is one that creates social conflict. However, it is one that is based on mutual necessity. The workers need access to the means of production, and so that's what they get from the capitalists, and the capitalists need workers to work the means of production. However, if the capitalists do not need workers to work the means of production, that relationship is broken apart And in conditions of scarcity, it may make sense for the capitalists to simply get rid of the superfluous former workers.
Yeah, definitely. And he sort of kind of like quotes from an author, E.P. Thompson, I think was writing in 1980, on Notes on Exterminism, the Last Stage of Capitalism, in which he sort of explores this like increasing militarization of capitalist production. And then like, so if you go back to Marx, you kind of get this idea that different economic relations in different parts of history produce different social relations. So the hand mill gives you feudalism, while the steam mill gives you capitalism. But according to Thompson, the sort of military-industrial complex, or like a society which produces a lot of murderous equipment, kind of inevitably gives you an exterminist society. The social relation is kind of informed by the economic base on which it's built.
It's that old saw about when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Which we're seeing a lot of with like policing in this, particularly in the States right now, where you've got a lot of military hardware being distributed to police districts, and then when when big, huge crises kick off, like hurricanes hitting major cities and such, the police don't really have tools or training or equipment to deal with those crises constructively, such as flood defenses and evacuation and rebuilding. But what they do have is a pile of machine guns.
Yeah, they have like APCs and, machine guns and SMGs and stuff like that. Yeah, and it's the militarization of the police force because of a surplus of military production, right? Like it's like, yes, of course it is about policing the population and oppressing the population, but it's also about creating like sort of escape valves on military production surplus. Like, oh, let's just like, I don't know what we can do with all these weapons we produced for the Iraq War. Let's just give them all to the cops, right?
It's pretty insane the way that whole system of production is set up. And Fraser kind of talks about like like a kind of an enclave society, which I think is there's quite a nice little line in here about it being a kind of an inverted gulag where there are islands of wealth, like guarded and walled islands of wealth strewn around a world of misery, which I think is quite a neat way to see it. I think we see a lot of that in our like science fiction already. You look at the kind of world of like Deus Ex in particular is a kind of a decent example of like these enclave societies that are kind of walled away from all the kind of horrifying devastation that's outside them. It's very evident in the new Blade Runner film too.
Oh, well, don't spoil that because I can't see it yet because the rentier regime that we all live under has forbidden access for me to this film in Japan until the end of the month. So
I think once you've had a chance to see it, we might have to do an episode on it because a lot of the themes of the rentist and exterminist societies really show up in the kind of background fiction of that film.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. So yeah, I would be into that. We'll look forward to that, listeners.
That's going to be good. Yeah. So but he kind of then draws this line from enclave to genocide, and he kind of uses an example I hadn't really considered before, but like the occupation of Palestine, where up until the 90s, Israel relied on Palestinian labor as a cheap labor force. But in the 90s onwards, they got in a lot more cheap labor from Asia, which made the Palestinians irrelevant. And that opened the door for more of this kind of hyper-aggressive foreign policy that they had. And I hadn't really thought of that before. I was like, no, that does make sense. It's like once you've made a laboring class irrelevant, either through automation or through finding a different laboring class to do the dirty work for you, then you're kind of free to just crank up the exterminist rhetoric, which is kind of exactly what happened with the intensifying assaults on Gaza.
Yeah, and I mean, it kind of reminds me of some of the critical work being done by Indigenous scholars in Canada about like the relationship that Indigenous people have had to capital in North America and many other places, I suppose, has not been the wage labor relation. It has been about, and because it has not been about the wage labor relation and it has primarily been about the seizure of land and access to land, I think, that has facilitated the extermination of indigenous populations in North America. And in a sense, exterminism is something that has been inherent in capitalism from the beginning, right?
Right, yeah. If you rewind to imperialism and colonialism, like that's we've already seen these kind of worlds in which, because like the way Phrase kind of phrases it is that it's a world in which scarcity cannot be overcome except for a small elite. And that's kind of already been the case throughout a lot of our history that we kind of like to forget about, but it's there. I mean, that's like, we've already had plenty of kind of examples of people just kind of rolling up to a new sort of land and deciding, you know what, fuck these people, they're not actually human, wipe them out. And that's like, I think I brought it up before, but like, if you consider how fucking callous and ugly and fucked up the rich already are today, and then imagine more automation and more ecological crisis leading to more and more conflict, like this is a natural conclusion to that, where they just decide, you know what, we're tired of these poors, taking up all the space, and we're tired of like spending money on the guard labor to keep them in line. So let's just fucking nuke them, I have this kind of vision of like tactical nukes being used against columns of refugees is the kind of the image of exterminism in my mind.
Is very ugly, and I think the image of exterminism that we can see staring us in the face right now is what's happened to Puerto Rico, right? Just terrible neoliberal policies being enforced on the island, and then ecological catastrophe destroying access to food supply and basic provisions, and then just the rich callously like leaving people to suffer and die. And it's kind of something you don't have to look very far to imagine,
No, it's not far away, it's kind of right on top of us. And as well as like the rich leaving the population to die, you've also got the likes of Elon Musk swooping in like a fucking vulture to privatize the energy resources on the island, or like to privatize the energy infrastructure. And Google have fucking swept in as well.
Yeah, it's sort of this next generation disaster capitalism, right? Like they just kind of show up and are like, well, the stolid old non-tech manifestations of capitalism haven't helped you out, but we're here to help you. We're going to do this amazing project, and the only thing you have to do is sign here on the dotted line and put yourself in endless debt and servitude to us in the future. I don't know. It all feels very much like one of those old cartoons where you sort of have the fox like shows up and has a big evil grin on his face.
Yeah,
getting
got, like,
into the chicken coop.
Oh no. And like we've kind of already seen that as well with like Hurricane Katrina all those years ago, where the capital class took that as an opportunity to just fucking privatize all the education that in the cities that were affected. Like all the schools are gone now. We can make them into like horrible private schools that are like much, much worse than what was there before. And just kind of like, yeah, it's this like capital never loses, right? Like under this system, they're the guys who always get ahead, regardless of what happens. And especially when disaster strikes, they get even more stuff captured in their clutches.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you just look at well, there's so many examples. It's almost hard to choose one, but you look at what's happened to the wealth of Black families in America since the 2008 crisis, and you look at what's happened to the wealth of the richest people in America, or even just the global capitalist class has been profiting off of the American real estate market and so on since the crisis, and the disparity is obvious. And that's, again, it's that kind of disaster capitalism, as Naomi Klein has described it.
It's predatory, and when you extrapolate that predatory sort of in behavior, and then add on more and more crises, you just get this like really awful behavior at the end of it all. Yeah, it's grim.
Yeah, it's a very grim vision of the future, and counterposed to that socialist picture. It kind of makes sense of like why that image of socialism is still attractive, even though it is a future of scarcity. I mean, one of the big reasons why I first got interested in Marxism was actually when I was in my master's degree. I was reading Thomas Friedman's, in many ways, terrible book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded, and just looking at like the picture of climate change he was presenting, and realizing to myself that, even though he doesn't say it in as many words, like this is a recipe for genocide on an almost unfathomable scale. And it's kind of like, that's not something I want to see, like yeah. we have a sort of increasing capacity to change the world through technological means, but we seem to be stuck on a path of driving ourselves towards this terrible exterminist future, and I think it's essential that we do something to avoid it.
Yeah, and that's something that key differentiator is the class relation. Like as long as we maintain this class-based society where one class very clearly dominates over the other, that domination will just be amplified by whatever kind of material changes occur. In the rentist future, we see how more and more automation just makes the kind of wealth disparities bigger, and the kind of like control of ideas and patterns and such is more and more calcified. In the exterminist future, we see the kind of just like outright violent kind of oppression being amplified as well.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And it's pretty stark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so with that, Frey's he wraps up with a small concluding section. I think the main sort of takeaways from that are that the future isn't inevitable. It's going to be the outcome of some kind of struggle, like a political movement or struggle. And the thing is that, like, if we continue to kind of sit down and do nothing, then the political struggle will continue to be what it has been for the last 40 or 50 years, which is the sort of right-wing interests and the capital interests just asserting their dominance largely unopposed.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at the sort of capitalist solutions to poverty and so on. Like, you look at, well, the recent study that was published that shows a trend of the wealth of Black families in America trending to zero. You see the long-term totally ineffective responses to poverty in the global South that the capitalist class has advocated. Just don't really make much of a dent at all. Like, you can't leave these disparities to the capitalist class, because at the end of the day, they're not interested in resolving them. They want to reinforce the hierarchy that exists.
Yeah, it's in their material interest to reinforce that hierarchy and keep going. And this is kind of what we're into, is like bringing back this kind of material analysis of history and of the society we're in. That like you can't trust these people to do the right thing. The only way you're going to have the right thing come about is through a social movement that agitates for the right thing to be done.
Right. Right.
Phrase also kind of wraps up with this kind of like cautionary sort of warning that like, even if we do end up in a kind of utopian society, the path towards it could be pretty brutal. History tends to be, tends to not like care very much about its victims, and that's been true all along. And it's kind of reasonable to expect that to still be true, even if we do transition into a kind of egalitarian society of plenty. And there's also paths between these futures. It's not really a guarantee we're going to end up with one of them and stick with it. I think we noted that the rentist future seems pretty unstable and is likely to would be likely to topple over into some other kind of a thing. But also it's worth considering that if we eventually ended up in, like, you can imagine ending up in the future that's described by communism, but it's arrived at through exterminism. Because in the exterminist future, you have a communism of the few for the rich. And then if the few eliminate the many, then the few become the many. And de facto, you end up with an egalitarian society, kind of, which is definitely worth keeping in mind that, it's not like a roulette table where the ball is going to settle into one of these pockets and that'll be it. There are transitional possibilities between the various futures.
Some more horrific than others.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we were talking earlier about the transition from socialism to communism, but there are other possibilities.
Where socialism would be a temporary austerity that would lead to better things. And Phrase then kind of wraps up with, I think, something that's worth quoting. And the line is that we can't go back to the past. We can't even hold on to what we have now. Something new is coming.
Yes. Yeah. And I think we can all feel that right now.
There's a definite sense that the status quo that we know, and especially the kind of financialized neoliberal form of capitalism just can't hold. Like it's already creaking under the contradictions within itself.
Yeah, and one thing that was kind of in vogue in the 90s, when you had this convergence of information society theory and social democracy, was this idea that education would be a bromide that could resolve these social contradictions, right? That somehow you could get an education and then that would bootstrap either your country out of a disadvantageous international trade position, or you could bootstrap yourself out of poverty through having education, through having skills. But one big thing we've seen is that automation makes a mockery of that, and even without that automation factor in play there's a lot of other factors that kind of show that it's not a sufficient response in any real meaningful way. Of course, education has many virtues, and as an educator myself, I'm not against it, but I don't think it's a social cure.
No.
We need more fundamental change.
We do, yeah, and we need fundamental and multifaceted change. And at the very least, we need to be directing people towards really thinking about both the material base and the kind of social relations. Because as we've seen with this kind of grid of futures, you can have a future of abundance. You can have like different possibilities in a future of abundance depending on what the social relations are, and the same goes for the futures of scarcity. And we've really gotten out of the habit of thinking about social relations. And I think it's like largely down to this kind of end of history idea, where it just looked like the capitalist system had simply won outright, and it would be impossible to replace. So a whole horizon of imagination and like possibility really shrank down in that kind of end of the century kind of period. But then it all turned out to not really work, right? Like history's back on, it's showtime again, and we're kind of like left with a bit of a dearth of imagination and thinking when it comes to contemplating the future.
Yeah, and I think that's why this article the 2011 article was so impactful when it came out, because it did have some imagination. It did present some possibilities, and that may seem a little bit more mundane in 2017, but it was quite notable in 2011.
Yeah, I mean, like 2011. I'm actually kind of surprised at how early the initial article came out, because like this way of articulating these possibilities for the future is still really kind of fresh and compelling, and you don't see a lot of it, considering the thing's been out for like 6 years. You would have kind of expected it to have more of an impact on kind of general kind of thinking on the left. But I think it says a lot then that like it was still necessary to actually publish a book in 2016, a full 5 years afterwards, before it really, and it's still then gathering an audience from that. So I think, like, in conclusion, a pretty compelling little bit of literature. So long as you come at it with the like not expecting it to produce very hard hitting analysis of a lot of stuff, but to kind of just provide jumping off points for thinking about these kind of topics.
Yeah, and I mean, as I said before, I think the real value in this book is just the presentation of the different schema it offers. I think that's a useful tool for thinking with, and I think it's valuable there.
I like to think of the book as offering up that schema and then asking the user to just use their imaginations largely. And it's not very hard to kind of let your imagination wander and like really explore these spaces. Yeah, I guess that kind of wraps it up for Futures. Is there anything else you want to cover that we didn't get around to? Any glaring gaps?
No, I think we've pretty much done it.
I think we've got it. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for listening. If anyone's listening, we'll be back in 2 weeks with. I think what we'll probably do is we'll pick an article or like a paper or something lighter to maybe pick over and use as a jumping off point for some discussion. In the meantime, we've got a Twitter account. You can find us at GIUnitPod. It turns out that General Intellect Unit is far too long to be a username on Twitter. You're probably listening to this on a podcasting app of some kind, or you're staring at a website. There is undoubtedly links on there as well that can get you to the various places we are. Yeah, I guess that's it. We'll see you in 2 weeks for some more discussion on, I guess, the general cybernetic Marxism that we're kind of into.
Yes.
Fabulous.
See you then.
All right. Bye.